Okay, we're going to talk about medieval Europe. This is lecture 16A. So when last we checked in on Europe, aside from the Byzantine Empire is one thing, but the Western Roman Empire has collapsed in 476. And the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was not a sudden thing. It was, as I'll talk about in a little bit, it's a series of collapses and disturbances in civilization and society that happen over a couple hundred years. But historians point to 476 as the last time there's somebody who's everyone accepts is the Western Roman Emperor. So when you look at what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire, you really have to realize there's three distinct cultural trends that come together to form medieval Europe, and they mix in ways that they didn't mix under the Romans, although they were all there under the Romans. The first is the Roman legacy, and this is exactly what you'd think. There was a Roman sense of having a bureaucracy, having a lot of trade, what Roman cities would look like, what Roman roads would look like. So there was an ideal that Europeans sort of remembered, and they had it in their writings, and it was a cultural memory of what a really highly organized, functioning society felt like. And in particular, they had this idea of unifying all of Europe, or all of what they would call Christendom, because I'll talk about the Christian influence in a minute. But they want to unify all of Christendom into a single empire, because the memory of Rome is that there's supposed to be a single big empire over all of Europe. And so the Roman legacy shows up in lots of places, lots of ways, and it shows up in laws sometimes. It shows up in the bureaucracy of the church, because the church was established as a bureaucracy under the Roman Empire, and the church would survive up to the present day. So the church's bureaucracy is in many ways the Roman bureaucracy. But then there are also Roman roads and Roman cities and Roman walls and Roman buildings and there's Roman literature, etc. And so there's a lot of ways in which this Roman legacy continues. People remember it. There are bits and pieces of Roman culture that people keep using. The Germanic legacy comes from the barbarians who have invaded Rome. And we saw that in the last couple hundred years of the Western Roman Empire, just more and more barbarians were moving in, right? You had the Visigoths, and you had the Vandals, and you had the Lombards, and you had the Franks, and the Angles, and Saxons, and Jutes, and there's just all sorts of different barbarian groups, the Burgundians. And so these groups brought a different sort of culture, and especially the ones that arrived late, right when the Roman Empire was collapsing. They had very little experience of living under the Roman Empire, so they brought their culture in, and it was still vibrant for them. It wasn't something that they had sort of given up to become Romans. The Germanic legacy was a warrior culture. Right? These guys were fighters, and they often formed what was called a posse comitatus, which is a war leader would get the loyalty of a bunch of soldiers, and they would all pledge personal loyalty to him, and then they would go out and do raids and fight other groups, etc. And so there was a whole lot in this culture that celebrated the individual strongman warrior. It celebrated being able to fight and warrior culture. It was a fairly misogynistic culture. I mean, the Romans were misogynistic also, patriarchal. But there are a lot of ways in which the Germanic culture was actually openly misogynistic. They actually treated women badly. And so the Germanic culture was focused on this sort of bands of warriors and the sort of bonds that warriors made with each other. And we'll see that this actually shapes the European idea of kingship. And when it comes back, when feudalism emerges late in the middle of the Middle Ages, we'll see that it's often based on this sort of Germanic sense of personal oaths of loyalty. And I want to point out, this is really different than the Roman idea. The Roman idea is somebody holds the office of governor of a province, and all the soldiers owe their obedience to that person because they occupy that office. It's not a personal oath to that person. It's a loyalty to the office. The same way that people in the United States, in the military or in the government, take an oath to the Constitution, not to the person who happens to be president or whatever. And so the difference between the Roman and Germanic legacies can be pretty profound. We'll see how that plays out. The third legacy is a really complicated one. It's the Christian legacy. Now, obviously, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire for the last several hundred years. And the Roman Empire had established this huge church with they divided everything up bureaucratically, and they had bishops and archbishops, etc., as various levels of the hierarchy and parish priests, and it was all very organized and bureaucratic. That church survives, but it doesn't survive in the same way, because in a lot of ways, as Roman society falls apart, in any particular given city or region, the church, a particular bishop might become a major political leader, but and might hold the church together really well. But in other areas, the church sort of disintegrates and falls apart. And in a lot of areas, the peasants just go on without a church. Essentially, they don't see there's no church presence there. And the church as a whole kind of breaks up. There's still an ideal. Everybody recognizes the Pope in Rome as being the top of the church, and everybody recognizes the bishops and archbishops. But there's a real sense in which the communication just gets so bad that the church in England really isn't talking much to the church in Rome, and the church in Germany isn't talking to the church in France. And so things are going their own directions, and the church would struggle and really succeed only after hundreds of years to reintegrate itself, to build itself again, if you will. But there's a really key idea that comes out of early Christianity, or the Christianity at the end of the Roman Empire, which is called the City of God ideal. And it was put forth by a bishop named Augustine of Hippo. Hippo is actually in North Africa, in Tunisia today. Augustine was one of the giants of the early church. He was a major writer and philosopher of the early church. And in 410, as I mentioned previously, the Visigoths had torn through all of the Roman Empire, raping and pillaging and looting and sacking and destroying. They had sacked Rome in 410, the Visigoths. A bunch of Germanic barbarians had sacked Rome. And this was a huge crisis for a lot of people. This was like earth-shaking. They just couldn't imagine that Rome could itself, the city, could be sacked, because Rome stood in for the whole empire. And so a lot of people suddenly, with the Visigoths in Rome, began to say, oh my gosh, what if the Roman Empire can actually fall? What if the Roman Empire dies, right? And for a lot of Christians in particular, this was an interesting question. This was a problem, because Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire, and they were so closely entwined that a lot of Christians were worried that the religion of Christianity wouldn't survive the fall of the Roman Empire. And Augustine wrote a book called The City of God as an answer to that. And basically what Augustine says is this. He says, when you become a Christian, you have to choose, are you going to live for God, or are you going to live for yourself? If you live for God, you're going to put your soul, so to speak, in the city of God. And now the real city of God is heaven. But for a Christian, Augustine says, you can start living now focused on heaven. And what that means is you can say, I'm going to focus on all the spiritual things that will get me into heaven. I'm going to focus on God. I'm going to focus on spiritual growth. I'm going to focus on being moral and living a good life, focused on heaven. He says, or you could just live in the city of the world, which is what he calls the other option. And the city of the world is all the things in this world, right? If you live in the city of the world, you care about your career, you care about making money, you care about your marriage, you care about your kids, you care about sex, you care about a nice house, you care about fame, you care about fortune, you care about nice clothes. All those things are the city of the world. And if you care about those things, Augustine basically says, you're not really a Christian. Because a real Christian is trying to live in the city of God, which means you don't care about clothes, house, career, fame, fortune, wealth. None of that matters, right? Because you're focused on living in God's house. You're focused on living in the city of God, which means living spiritually, living for God, and rejecting sin and rejecting greed and gluttony and lust and all the other mortal deadly sins. And so Augustine basically says, for Christians, the Roman Empire is the city of the world, right? Yeah, it's there. It might fall. But that's the city of the world. Christians don't care about the city of the world. Christians care about the city of God, and the Roman Empire doesn't matter to the city of God. And Augustine actually lays out this sort of vision of history. He says there's really two timelines in history. There's the timeline for the history of the world, city of the world, and that's all these empires that rise and fall, and cities get built, and cities get destroyed, and great conquerors conquer things, everything we're talking about in this course. That's the city of the world, and that doesn't matter, he says. But there's also the timeline of the city of God, and that's the timeline of things that matter to God. And so that's, Moses and the flood, and the Ten Commandments, and that's Jesus' life, and that's everything to do with Christians being good Christians, right? And so for Augustine, the city of God timeline is about God's relationship to humanity, and it's all the things that matter to God. That's totally different than the city of the world timeline. The city of the world timeline is filled with a whole bunch of events that don't matter. They don't mean anything. And the fall of the Roman Empire is on the city of the world timeline. It doesn't matter. So Augustine gives this sort of vision of how Christians should live. They should sort of reject all the pleasures of the material world and focus on their spiritual life and focus on the things that matter to God, which is morality and spirituality and prayer and etc. and worship. And this actually becomes a very powerful idea. It becomes maybe the central idea of medieval Europe is that they will try to build a whole society that is the city of God. They're going to try to build a society around what does God want, right? How does God want our society organized? How does God want us to live, etc. And I want to point out the city of God ideal is a really close analog to the Dar al-Islam idea, in the sense that you're going to build a society around God's will. You're going to have laws and governments, etc., that sort of enforce God's will, and so this civilization is going to be focused on the will of God, not on the will of human beings, right? And that's built right into Dar al-Islam. Islam means submission to the will of God. It's built into the city of God ideal also. So they're kind of parallel, right? They're pretty similar. But another reason that Augustine's idea became so popular is that civilization really is falling apart, right? There's all sorts of horrible things happening in the 500s and 600s. We now know that the climate change, a little bit of climate change happened, that the average temperature in Europe got colder, and that this brought later frost in the spring and earlier frost in the fall, so a shorter growing season. It brought more rain, and so it appears that that climate change caused a series of bad harvests, and this might even have had a role to play in the fall of the Roman Empire, but we don't know for sure yet. But in addition to that, you of course have the Justinian plague, which I talked about previously, which sweeps through the Mediterranean in the 540s, and then there are these waves of plague all the way up into the 600s. And that kills a significant portion of the population. But then, with the fall of the Roman Empire, you gradually see civilization come apart, right? This happens in all sorts of ways. One is that without a Western Roman Empire, there is nobody minting coins anymore. There's no more coins being minted. Now you might say, oh, well, just use the coins that are there, except that every time Western Europeans bought something from the Eastern Roman Empire, the coins went to the Eastern Roman Empire. And because the West didn't have the population and the money to keep buying things they're selling things to the East and getting those coins back, basically coins began to just disappear from the Roman Empire and they didn't come back. And so over the course of 150 years, money simply disappears because nobody's making new coins. And so by the 600s, many places in Europe are on a barter economy. There's simply no money circulating at all. Well, without money, trade also starts to dry up, right? I mean, without the government protecting trade routes and roads and things, that's a problem. But certainly without the circulation of money and without our Roman legions protecting things, there's very little trade going on, right? There's very little possibility for trade. And so as trade dries up, you also see cities start to shrink, because one of the major reasons for cities is trade and manufacturing, and that begins to dry up. And also you have these barbarian armies, these Germanic barbarian armies plowing around and sacking cities and things. Cities are targets. And so what you see happen over the course of about 100 years after the fall of the Roman Empire is cities shrink. They often they often wind up being about 10% as big as they were at the height of the Roman Empire. So Rome itself was over 1 million people under the Roman Empire. It's less than 100,000 by the 600s, right? And the similar thing happens across Europe, that city after city just shrinks by about 90%, right? And if cities are shrinking and money is shrinking and trade is drying up, you begin to see education disappear. There's no merchant class who's teaching their kids how to read and write, etc. The church continues to teach its monks and priests how to read and write, but that's only monks and priests. And what you see happen is literacy rates across Europe plummet, right? And without trade and without education, et cetera, you also see life expectancies plummet. And partly this is the climate change, and partly it's the plague and what have you. But life expectancies drop, right? And so the population as a whole drops. And so Europe really is sort of uncivilizing itself for about 150 years, right? Through the 500s and the 600s and into the 700s, Europe is really struggling just to hold anything together, right? Well, you might say, well, what about new governments? Couldn't there be a new government that emerges? And you're absolutely correct. And what we see is that at first, when the Roman Empire collapses, you see a whole bunch of Germanic tribes try to establish kingdoms. I talked about Theodoric, who got sent by the Eastern Roman Emperor to go and try to conquer Italy, and he did. And he founded what's called the Ostrogothic kingdom, but it didn't. When he died, it fell apart. Right? And you see similar things happening. The Visigoths would establish a kingdom in Spain, and it would last for 100 years, maybe 150 years, but it was totally unstable, and it fell apart. Right? And so you see, and the Vandals established a kingdom in North Africa, but the Byzantines knocked that off. So the kingdoms that the barbarians set up, the Germanic tribes set up, are often really unstable, and they don't last very long. And you know, these the ones I just mentioned were the sort of success stories that were stable for 50 years or 100 years. There's lots of other kingdoms that are stable for 10 years and then fall apart, or these little kingdoms, their whole experience is just unstable. So the only serious sort of success that comes out of this is the Merovingians. Right after the Roman Empire falls, there's a minor Germanic tribesman named Clovis, who, well, actually, when the Roman Empire falls, his father is this minor Germanic king who has been sort of hired by the Romans to do border security. He has a little kingdom in what we call Belgium today. After the Roman Empire falls, his son, Clovis, would then set out and sort of reconquer a lot of France, and he would found a kingdom that went on to become the Merovingians. And they would last for quite a while, up until the mid-700s, and then they would sort of be overthrown by their own advisors or their senior generals who founded the Carolingian dynasty. And the Carolingians, the high point of the Carolingians was under Charlemagne. Charlemagne, which is Latin for Charles the Great, or it's the French bastardization of the Latin for Charles the Great. He unified much of Western Europe, right? He didn't quite conquer Spain, but he conquered some of Spain. But he conquered all of France and Belgium and Holland and most of Germany and chunks of like Hungary and Austria and Italy. And so he creates a really big kingdom. And the Pope would actually crown him as a new Holy Roman Emperor, right? But the Carolingian monarchy would also begin to fall apart after Charlemagne dies, and under his grandsons, it would basically get split into three and then get split into two, which roughly correspond today, well, the three today roughly correspond to Germany, France, and Italy. So politically, the early part of the Middle Ages was this big, it was a period of struggling to find some stability, struggling to find some sense of normalcy. But civilization is really falling apart. And because civilization is falling apart, people are clinging to the city of God ideal, right? That well, if this world sucks, if the city of the world sucks, why not live in the city of God? Why not focus on heaven? Why not focus on religion? If there's really no pleasure to be had in the physical world anyway, what's the attraction there, right? In the next part of the lecture, I will talk about Vikings and Magyars and feudalism, and then the High Middle Ages.